I grew up in Iowa in the Midwest. I went to Wesleyan University to college, got very interested in physics there, although until the end of my junior year, I had as much history in my portfolio as physics and almost made a decision in that direction. I went to graduate school for a year at Stony Brook. At the end of that year, this was during the last phases of the Vietnam War, I was drafted, spent 3 years in the Army. Fortunately, I was never overseas. I returned to graduate school, but I had gotten interested in a part of physics that was being done notably at the universities in the Triangle area of North Carolina, so Chapel Hill, Duke, and North Carolina State. I had a fellowship that was portable, so I just chose to go to Chapel Hill to finish my degree. From there, I went as a postdoctoral fellow to Los Alamos, was there as a staff member for 9 years, and then I had my midlife crisis and decided to become an academic, and Vanderbilt beckoned. So I've been here since the late 1980s.
Oh wow, that's really interesting. So the next question is like what prompted your interest in research? You mentioned the midlife crisis. Like what was the thought process?
I think I was always attracted to the idea of teaching. What changed for me in probably my junior year of college, as I began to do research for what became my senior thesis, I began to realize that research and teaching compete for the same time and therefore are in tension with one another, but it is a productive tension in the sense that what you learn doing research also enriches what you're able to share with students in the classroom. And that realization was sharpened even further when I went to Chapel Hill to graduate school. One of the faculty members with whom I was a teaching assistant was teaching a course that was called, I think, Science and Society or something like that. But it was a course about science for people who were not going to be professional scientists. I think in that context, then I really understood how important it was to be able to share what it means to commit yourself to research, especially as I tell my students, what it means when you're interested in a question where the answer is not in the back of any book and the question is not in the book either. Part of what I find attractive about a life of research is continually saying what questions are really interesting. How do you formulate a plan to learn that is not just a random collection of facts, but answers some question that really moves you and feels important?
Yeah, definitely. And that's also one of the reasons why I'm kind of getting into research, is because I feel like that curiosity just drives you. What is your research about? And like, do you mind explaining it in like simplified terms for a high schooler?
I am interested in what happens to light in very tiny structures. So structures that are bigger than molecules, but smaller than, let's say, substantially smaller than the diameter of a human hair. A world that is often called the world of nanoscience, where the distances are measured in nanometers, that is a billionth of a meter. Excuse me. And the reason why that's interesting is, first of all, a lot of materials do not behave the same way when you have just a little tiny piece of it. So let me give you an example. The reason why gold is called a precious metal and why it's prized for jewelry, it does not interact chemically with anything. So it doesn't tarnish, for example, like silver does. It turns out that if you assemble a collection of gold atoms, 60 or so, with a diameter on the order of 3 nanometers, the gold becomes chemically extremely reactive. You can actually use it as a chemical catalyst
I didn't know.
for a reaction that involves sulfur, for example. So this idea was summarized nicely by Uzi Landman, who was a physicist at Georgia Tech, under the label "small is different." And so that's interesting. And the reason why it's interesting in conjunction with light is that normally in most materials, if you look at something that is small, that is smaller than the wavelength of light, light will be just absorbed or reflected. But in nanometer size structures, you can get light to travel in waveguides, for example, that are much smaller than the wavelength of light. And I'll show an example of that. This is from, here's an example. One of my colleagues with whom I collaborate very frequently is Sharon Weiss in electrical engineering. And Sharon is very interested in a field that is called silicon photonics. That is, how do you do with light what computer people do with electrons in silicon? So how do you make switching circuits and how do you transmit light in waveguides? So here's an experiment that we did that was published 4 years ago now almost. The idea is to take two synchronized pulses of light, which last about 10 to the minus 13 seconds each, 1300 on 10 to the minus 13 seconds. One beam is at the frequency of light that is used in telecommunications at about 1.5 microns, so just beyond what your eye can see. And we start a train of pulses that you see represented here in blue traveling down this waveguide. Now, this waveguide is only 1/4 as big as the wavelength of the light. And in principle, light, it shouldn't transmit any light at all. But it turns out that is not necessarily the case. You can actually transmit the light very efficiently. When we put into the waveguide this little section of green, which is a material called vanadium dioxide, when we hit that with a synchronized laser pulse of a slightly longer wavelength, it changes the VO2 from being an insulator and transmissive to being a metal and reflective, and it actually blocks the light from traveling farther down. And so we're using light to control this switch and thereby control the transmission of light down this waveguide. The reason this matters is that the speed with which we can do this is about 100 times faster than any electronic switch. So in an era when the transmission of data is extremely important, at where you have very high volumes of data that need to be transmitted very fast, this is interesting potentially for practical purposes. Of switching takes place in less than a trillionth of a second.
Wow.
So that this is an example of the kind of physics that we like to do in my group.
What made you narrow down into focusing on light?
That happened after my postdoctoral year. I was trained I did my PhD in nuclear physics with spin polarized nuclei. Just thinking about the way the field was changing, and thinking about a long career of tens of years, I had decided I really didn't want to do that for the rest of my life. And there are in principle many reasons for that. There are all kinds of reasons why people make decisions like that. Some of it has to do with finding a way to live and to be part of a community and give of yourself that you find satisfying. And some things fit better than others. As I was then a postdoc at the Los Alamos National Laboratory, I was interested in switching fields, and I had an opportunity to join a group that was looking at making energy by laser fusion, which is something that's been in the news in California a lot lately because of the experiments at Livermore, which I have followed with great interest. I didn't know word one about laser. When I applied for the job, my nuclear physics background turned out to be useful, as was my general experimental training. And so I switched over to working with light and lasers. And then I had an opportunity to spend a year in Germany. We took our family to Germany, and I spent a year at a little German university learning about how to use light to study the behavior of atoms and molecules on surfaces. And that kind of led me to think that that's something I could really spend the rest of my life happily doing. And eventually, after I came back from that year in Germany, I decided to leave Los Alamos and come to the faculty at Vanderbilt. What happened at Vanderbilt was even more fun. I discovered that I have colleagues like my friend Sharon Weiss, who are doing things in electrical engineering that are adjacent to physics, but not physics. And I realized that I could make a contribution. I enjoyed working together with her and her students, and my students learned something about engineering, and her students learned something about physics from the collaboration. And so everybody benefited. And over the years, I've acquired more collaborators around at the university and indeed around the world. And so I have students right now who are making vanadium dioxide thin films and devices for people, for our collaborators in Denmark, the United Kingdom, Japan, and Australia. And I think that what has made physics so satisfying for me is the social aspect. Scientists are usually pictured as people who want to be all by themselves. They
Yeah.
wear white coats, they work in laboratories. Let me tell you, it's not happening. What makes science fun is the friendships and the collaborations that you develop with people who become part of your circle of, in some cases, almost like your family.
But also earlier you mentioned about like looking into the future and trying to see how like technology evolves. Where do you see your field going in the next 10 years? And like what can students begin to focus on?
That's a really interesting question. I think the area that we are working on that I think for the near term looks especially fruitful is the idea of using these so-called quantum materials like VO2 to make things that work better. So one of my students currently, for example, my students, by the way, all choose their own project. I've learned from my wife not to take ownership of things that our children do or that my students do. And one of my students came in who was really wanted to find something to work on that had to do with sustainability and climate. And he discovered that there is a material, another vanadium oxide that is lanthanum vanadate, that has been predicted to be twice as efficient as silicon
Oh, wow.
at harvesting solar photons. Now, a factor of 2 change in efficiency in that would be really, really interesting. And it's a field that is just people are just beginning to turn to this. And so that's an example of where a seemingly exotic material and its interactions with light looks like it could be really interesting, not only for the science. We'd like to know, does the theory really hold up? Can we show that by measurements? But also the possibility that maybe someday people could really make solar cells out of this material. So more generally, I think the field of nano devices, nanoscale electronics, and nanoscale optics, which a lot of people these days talk about it as nanoscale photonics. I think that looks like something that is going to influence not only science, but also daily life for a considerable time to come, because the goal of nanophotonics is to reduce the size and scale of things that are practical and to make, for example, sensors that are really small and could be incorporated into places where you would like to know what's happening with, let's say, the stress and strain on a bridge. And people are learning how to embed nanoparticles that emit light when they're under stress, put them in optical fibers, and embed those fibers in concrete so that you can shine light through them and see how the members of a sensitive structure like a bridge, how they are being affected by the stresses and strains of cars going over them, heaven forbid, ships bumping into them, or other events like that. That kind of work, I think, is going to unite the fields of science and engineering in a very important way. Truth to tell, now my father was an engineer, as was his father. And some people will tell you that science and engineering are really different. But the fact is that good science is where you find it. And it's often in very practical problems that turn out to have interesting scientific questions associated with them.
But also those applications are things that I just haven't really thought about. Like it would have never crossed my mind to combine those two fields.
And I think you're seeing a lot of that fields that we historically thought were completely separate are merging as scientists talk to one another and learn from one another. So my colleague down the hall, Shane Hudson, uses lasers to look at wound healing in biological structures using the same kind of spectroscopy tools that I do, but his interest is very much in the biomedical arena. But we in effect speak the same language. It just happens that the materials that he studies happen to be living tissue. And the ones that I study are things that we can make in the laboratory and synthesize. But we speak a common language when we talk about the way light influences materials by changing their structure or doing photochemistry or any number of other things you could imagine.
You mentioned you have a lot of students in your lab. What makes someone stand out to you? Like, what traits make you be like, oh, I want that person to work in my lab?
The ability to ask interesting questions. And the other thing, of course, is the willingness to do the hard work of learning things that you didn't understand before. And
Yeah.
some people don't have the patience to keep working at something until they get it. Fortunately, I think that tendency is rarer in people who want to do science. This may surprise you. I would say also an appreciation for the aesthetic beauty of science. Science is a beautiful intellectual structure. The idea that you could, by asking questions and learning how to ask more clever questions and find better and better ways to develop answers. I think that's a beautiful thing, and that's true of any serious intellectual endeavor.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you on that point. And I also like the fact that your questions almost like build on each other and it's all built on like a foundation of logic. So from one point, you can always work your way to another point.
Paul Dirac, famous physicist who developed the theory of electrons and positrons, once said that it is more important to have that your equations should be beautiful than that they should be correct, because in the end, once you make the corrections, they will be even more beautiful. I think there's a lot of truth in that. To appreciate the elegance of a concise description of something very complicated in nature, that's a lovely thing.
Do you have any other tips for high schoolers hoping to go into the field of physics?
First of all, study lots of math. Physics is where mathematics and science intersect most strongly. But I would say also learn from the history of science. Look at the examples, the history of how scientific discoveries get made, how it is that people are able to progress over long periods of time to answer the same question. And then the last one may surprise you, but it's a phrase from an essay that I give all my graduate students. It's 1 page long, a distinguished molecular biologist. And the title of this 1 page essay is The Importance of Stupidity in Scientific Research. And the background for this is that he describes being acquainted with a woman who came into graduate school at the same time he did in science, but who left after her second year. As it turns out, she went to Harvard Law School and has had a very distinguished career herself. But he ran into her years later and asked her, why did she give up science? And she said, because she couldn't stand the feeling of being stupid, day after day, feeling like she was bumping up against a brick wall in her search to understand whatever it was she was studying. And Professor Schwartz then describes his own reaction when his advisor suggested a possible problem for him to work on for his doctorate. And he would go into the library day after day, couldn't find anything. And he was about to give up when he realized, oh, the reason why I can't find anything is because nobody knows the answer to this question. And so if I just use my training, the skills I've learned, and try to be conscientious and honest about it, what I do can be a real contribution to science. And he calls that attitude learned ignorance, being willing to be ignorant and learn how to ask questions so brick by brick you construct the answer to that question. And I think being willing to live with that frustration is a very important characteristic of scientists. I mean, how many stories do you know of scientists who struggle and struggle and struggle and can't get where they think they want to go, and then suddenly something opens up and they're able to solve a problem or whatever? The patience and I would call it the serenity to be able to accept being ignorant and toiling away as best you can, that is really characteristic of the great scientists.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, again, that's something that's not just talking about enough.
One other thing I would say, and this is more an emotional stance, in science, as in most other phases of life, you will always run into people who seem to be, I emphasize the word seem, who seem to be smarter than you are, quicker than you are, more experienced, whatever. When you run into that, you have a couple of choices. One is to say, well, there's just no way I can do this because look at so and so who is so much better than I am. The other approach you can take, and it's important to be able to do this, is to say, look, I may not be the next Einstein, but I can do good work and I can find a way to make what I do in science satisfying, something that brings me pleasure and indeed happiness. I think that's also a critical attitude to develop, is to recognize that there are all kinds of places in what somebody has called the Republic of Science. There are all kinds of places where you can be and be a contributor and enjoy and find happiness in what you're doing. And it is really important to be happy.
Yeah.
There's the history of science is filled with examples of people who were brilliant and were unhappy and did not have satisfying lives.
Yeah, it's not a good path to take if this isn't driven by like genuine curiosity. Yeah, that's all the questions I have for today. I really enjoyed talking to you, and thank you so much for your time.